Okay, you're good to go.
Wonderful. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Spring Brown Bag Research Series. It's my great pleasure to introduce Shayna Rosenbaum, who would be our first speaker of the semester. Shayna is a professor and York Research Chair in the Department of Psychology and Vision, Science to Application, known as VISTA program at York University. So coming to us from Toronto, Canada. She's also an associate scientist at the Rotman Research Institute at Baycrest. She's registered as a clinical neuropsychologist with the College of Psychologists in Ontario. Received her PhD in psychology from the University of Toronto in 2004 and completed postdoctoral fellowship at the Rotman. She has published extensively on topics of memory, decision-making. We'll hear a lot of what she's been working on right now later on. She also received awards for her neuroimaging and patient research, including Sloan Research Fellowship, an early career award from the Canadian Association for Neuroscience, Canadian Society for Brain, Behavior, and Cognitive Sciences, and the International Neuropsychological Society. Her research is funded by the Canadian Institute of Health Research and the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada. She is also an elected member of the Royal Society of Canada College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists. So it's, with all those accolades, it's really a great pleasure of us to have you come and talk to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here, and thank you so much, Noah, for inviting me, and thank you to your center for inviting me, and really to be amongst the greats of aging research. And I'm sorry to disappoint from the start, but I will not be presenting neuroimaging research today, although I'm happy to speak to some of our separate neuroimaging findings. But what I thought I would focus on today actually brings me back to, I think, where my heart lies, which is studies of individual single cases and also studies in aging. And what I hope we can learn from those cases, especially as the data relate to understanding episodic memory and how it relates to future imagining, amongst other abilities. I'm happy later on if anybody has questions about research that we are conducting on spatial navigation to speak to you about that, but it's very separate from what I'll be focusing on today. So I did change my title slightly because I thought it encompassed the problem that we were really concerned with, which is how do we understand the relationship between episodic memory, future thinking, even spatial navigation, theory of mind, all of these abilities that seem to relate to a common network of regions that underlie resting state and that really are considered as part of a default mode network. I'm not going to really touch more on that, but just to say that we really do want to understand, at least from a functional perspective, what these common areas of activity mean. And some of what I'll describe to you, some observations actually initially that we made in certain cases sort of spoke against what we would have predicted based on this like commonality in network connectivity and activations. So I hope you're welcome to ask questions throughout. But just to say that I've really been interested in episodic memory in particular because different theories of hippocampal function make different predictions about how episodic memory should be supported by the hippocampus and related brain structures. So that was really my starting point. And I was very fascinated, like many people over the last, I would say, almost 2 decades, by findings that there is this intimate relationship between, or seemingly intimate relationship between episodic remembering and future imagining. And I'll speak to that shortly. But after working with different patient populations, working with neurotypical older adults, it seemed to me that maybe ideas about how episodic memory serves future imagining might be overextended. So I hope to make the case that people who have the most severe forms of amnesia, who actually seem to have severe episodic memory deficits, are not necessarily stuck in time. And this metaphor of being in this permanent present tense, as Sue Porkin titled her biography of the famous case HM, but even in popular culture, similar metaphors, thinking of the hippocampus as a time machine, or even a quote from Memento. If any of you have seen that excellent movie, but just this idea that, you know, if you lose episodic memory, then you're just stuck in time. You're in a perpetual present. And I don't think that this metaphor adequately captures the mental life of the amnesic person. And I think is a less severe case, a person who is experiencing even typical aging, that, you know, as our episodic memory seems to decline, yes, maybe some aspects of future thinking decline, but not all aspects. And, you know, this really speaks to agency that we perhaps assign to older adults. And so the research question that I'll focus on today is, to what extent is episodic memory needed for future thinking and different forms of future regarding decisions? I'll speak to some research that we've conducted, and it, I think, resonates with some of you here, on intertemporal choice, so deciding between smaller immediate rewards versus larger later rewards. You'll understand why we've focused on that in a moment, but really it's to separate out different components of future thinking. I will touch on applications to compliance with public health measures in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. Kind of as a side note, I was actually going to have that as the major thrust of the talk that I was going to give to you today, but I thought that I kind of liked this story a little bit more, and having that as not a tangent, but an application of some of the work that we've conducted. And then I'm going to focus on, I'll move away from behavioral economics and focus on some tasks that were borrowed from social psychology relating to temporal control theory. And I'll explain what that is shortly. And I will present some case studies of individuals with episodic amnesia to support the case that I'm making, and also some studies that we've engaged in with younger and older adults. And so just to say that, you know, we've had really the privilege of working with individuals who have unique lesions, and particularly to the hippocampus bilaterally. Certainly no two patients or two individuals look alike. They're actually not patients. They're individuals who live in the community, who for various reasons have come to see us, but who actually function, I would say, some of whom function relatively independently despite their severe memory impairment. So that is a model for understanding hippocampal function, and actually perhaps even indirectly the function of connected brain regions. And I know that this figure is an old one and probably rather simplified, given the excellent work that's being done here. And I'm noting some of the work from Goggins' lab here, but really that you know, and I know this is the Center for Vital Longevity, that it's important to consider that aging is a process that needs to take into account early development, and you see changes, even structural changes. Again, this is a very simplified version, but this relates to hippocampal volume, and we can see changes structurally even in younger adulthood. And so, you know, how do we draw meaning from that? And what kind of predictions can we make, especially in terms of predicting different types of disease states? So I'll describe aging here as a model for understanding hippocampal function, but I do realize that I'm making a lot of assumptions, and it's not a simple story when it comes to the hippocampus and aging. So I just want to put it out there so that nobody attacks me and says, hey, you know, the hippocampus is not the most important structure. I would agree with you. But really, my story begins with this individual. So this is, as Endel Topping named him, the second most famous amusing person. I don't know if everyone would agree with that. His initials in the scientific literature were KC. His name was Kent Cochran. Sadly, he passed away a number of years ago. I worked with him for about 15 years. And I can tell you many stories about him. But what I want to show you here is that, and I hope this picture really depicts the severity of his episodic memory deficits. So he's sitting with his mother here, and he's reviewing a photo album of photos depicting very significant life events. He's looking at family photos. He knows who's present in the photos. He can name everyone. He can tell you where the photos were taken. What he couldn't tell you is what he did just before the photo was taken, just after. He couldn't tell you how he felt when he visited New Orleans for Mardi Gras, for example. He knew that he went to Mardi Gras, though. So this really shows this very fine functional dissociation between impaired episodic memory and what seems to be relatively spared semantic memory, although it's quite nuanced. But his brain was, he was neurologically messy, and I hate to use that term. This was actually from post-mortem neuroimaging that was conducted, painful for many of us who worked with him for many years. But what you can see here is, aside from his extensive medial temporal lobe lesions, I should have mentioned he suffered from a closed head injury from a motorcycle accident that affected much of his brain, and it actually resulted in a secondary stroke. So his hippocampus was actually affected from both sides, and that's why you see this almost complete loss of hippocampal tissue. Surprisingly, though, his dentate gyrus remained, but it didn't see it. I don't know what to make of that, but generally speaking, it's very difficult to assign a function to his hippocampus based on what is lost. So, we can't say for certain that his episodic memory deficits are due to his hippocampal damage, but what we can say perhaps is that his hippocampus is not absolutely necessary for areas of preservation. And so I'll leave you with that assumption and make this case for case studies. I feel like I added this in because I felt like, with the ubiquity of neuroimaging and, very important results that come from these innovative technologies, it's very easy to dismiss the value of single cases. And so I do want to mention that in the way that at least I view the value of working with single cases, I think it's important to note that functional dissociations can be as important or interesting as neurological dissociations. And in the cases that I'm describing, especially based on KC, preserved function may be more informative than impaired function. And of course, we can follow up these observations in using other methods, of course, including neuroimaging, larger group studies. And as I said, I'm going to be focusing today on episodic memory and future imagining, and I will also speak to some of our aging data. But just to make the case with respect to episodic memory, to follow the logic, we couldn't for certain say that Kent's episodic memory deficits were due to his hippocampal damage. And so we followed up this question a while ago, together with Brian Levine, actually, in Toronto, looking at very unique cases, one in particular who was referred to us from Australia, who had a very rare staph infection that affected his hippocampus bilaterally and seemed to leave relatively spared other parts of his brain. Of course, we don't know about any hidden pathology, and I know this imaging was really low quality at the time that we received it. But just to say that the prediction here is that somebody with very selective hippocampal lesions, if the hippocampus is needed for episodic memory, even that person should show very severe deficits for all times in that person's life in retrieving specific episodes, details of episodes from their life. And indeed, we found that this particular person, who's represented by this red line, and this is indicating the average number of, sorry, my cursor, of course, is not working on this screen, the average number of details produced. We asked participants to provide narratives of different events that happened throughout their lives, from childhood all the way to the past year. And the line in red, as I said, represents this, this individual. The other lines, the other colored lines represent, well, the bolded one, black line, represents control participants, and the other colors are other individuals with brain lesions who had less extensive hippocampal damage, more extensive damage to neocortical regions known to be involved in episodic memory, but their gradient of episodic memory loss is it's more temporal in nature, such that there is some preservation for certain time periods. And yet the person with the most selective hippocampal lesions and the least extensive damage overall was the one who was most severely impaired relative to controls, even when we probed participants to kind of support them in retrieving their episodic memories. So back to the story about the relationship between episodic memory and future imagining. Some of you might be familiar with a number of these studies, but I will point you to the initial observation that Endel Talving made when he was speaking with Kent, and noted that not only was he unable to provide details of past events, but when he was asked about future events, he would say that his mind was blank, that he couldn't imagine any specific happenings that might occur in the future. And others had been fascinated by this observation. I would say especially Eleanor Maguire, who sadly passed away recently, and Dan Schachter and members of their labs at the time. But I really do want to point out this study by Demis Hassabis, who, as some of you know, just received the Nobel Prize in chemistry for his AI research. But Demis, when he was in Eleanor's lab, they were interested in studying or testing this question in a group of their amnesic people who had as a common area of lesion the hippocampus bilaterally. And these individuals were not asked to imagine a future event or imagine a past event. They were just asked to imagine a scene. So there wasn't any temporal orientation. And yet, these individuals still had deficits in providing a temporally and spatially coherent, the focus was actually on spatial coherence in that study, a spatially coherent narrative describing the scene like a typical beach scene, for example. It seemed as though those descriptions lacked detail and, again, didn't really have a cohesiveness that you might expect based on how controls would describe the same kinds of scenes. So it's important to note that maybe the deficit that these individuals are experiencing isn't one that relates to remembering the past or orienting to the future to think about the future. Maybe there's something else that we need to consider. And it may be that we really need to separate out the narrative component of many of these tasks from the temporal orientation component. And so that's really what we try to achieve in our research. And so just to say that, and this is just a reminder of what I said at the very beginning, that early on, this is a review paper by Dan Schachter, Donna Rosa Addis, and Randy Buckner, and others also have made similar observations that a common area of region seems to underlie episodic memory, future imagining, and some other abilities that are of interest to me, but that are beyond the scope of today's talk. But really, does this mean that if you lose episodic memory, you're going to automatically lose all aspects of future thinking? And moving back to the question of temporal orientation, we decided to ask KC if he could provide details of past events that had never taken place. So we actually interviewed family members, and we had a good sense of some events that he had never experienced. And we wanted to see if he could imagine past-oriented events. So if he could think of details that could have taken place in the past. And he had trouble not just with future imagining, but even past imagining. So he's represented by the open white squares. And I apologize, this is number of details, like a total number of details per event. And relative to controls, he had a lot of difficulty describing imagined events for any imagined time period. An event could be like purchasing a pet, and they were kind of time limited and plausible events, but ones, again, that we knew had never taken place. We also asked Kent, and actually this was followed up in Mika Bergvali's lab. We asked him, and then eventually some other patients, to tell us Bible stories and fairy tales that we knew they had learned in the past, but that really are not, they're not personal in nature, but they do require narrative construction. And we found again that Kent had a lot of difficulty to provide the thematic elements of the fairy tales and Bible stories. So he certainly knew them, he knew the gist of them, and they were presented in the correct temporal sequence. But unlike controls, he had a lot of difficulty kind of filling in the details with respect to those stories. So again, this really tells us that it might be important to distinguish time-based judgments from narrative generation, and that the latter might be what is central to the, or more central to the impairment. Another example of this is work that part of a very long-standing collaboration with Carl Craver at Washington University, where we were interested in other aspects of time and how time is represented in individuals with amnesia. And we found that Kent had very little difficulty sequencing different events from his life on a timeline, for example. And the events that he did have difficulty with, which are circled, were either events that took place after the time of his lesion, so part of his anterograde amnesia, so it's not surprising, or were events that took place very close in time to just before his unfortunate motorcycle accident, including his motorcycle accident, which he couldn't place accurately in time. So now moving on to some of the tasks that we use to better understand this potential dissociation between narrative construction and future time orientation, we decided to turn to the behavioral economics literature and look at a task that actually doesn't require narrative construction, but does require consideration of the immediate versus future, the immediate time versus future times. And I've already said this, but really impaired episodic memory and future imagining might reflect this failure to subjectively orient in time or construction of event details. So to just orient you, I think some of you actually are studying this, but just in case, a typical intertemporal choice task, I just realized this might be on a timer. It might progress without me, but we asked participants to decide between hypothetical monetary rewards in this case. So deciding between choosing $1,000 today or $2,000 in this case 3 years from now. And we vary the delay between receiving the rewards. We have 7 delays, and we also vary the amount of the immediate reward. And we have 2 separate conditions. I'm showing you the $2,000 later reward condition, but we also have a $100 later reward condition. I'll focus on the 2,000 today, but we have similar results for $100. And there is a normal tendency to discount the value of the larger future reward with increasing delay between receiving the reward, and also with the amount of the immediate reward. So the larger the immediate reward, the less likely you're going to want to wait for the larger delayed reward. And with this logic, we were interested to know if somebody has impaired future imagining, are they going to show atypical discounting? Are they going to actually be perhaps, and we predicted, steeper discounting, where they have a stronger tendency to discount the future reward compared to typical neurotypical controls? Or might they look like neurotypical controls? And so we initially tested this question in a number of amnesic individuals with bilateral hippocampal lesions, including KC, Kent. I do want to mention that there is a very large body of work, very beautifully summarized by Kendra here, and especially in relation to aging, looking at the relationship between discounting and different health outcomes, financial outcomes. We actually conducted a study. It was led by Kai Ruggieri at Columbia University, showing that this tendency to discount the future is globalizable, that we actually see it. We tested people in 61 countries and found that there were very similar tendencies, or I don't want to really call them biases, but changes in the way that we discount based on economic inequality, for example, and other income disparities. And so that seems to actually be one of the strongest predictors, at least based on our work and that of others, showing that, predicting that you would see steep discounting in neurotypical individuals. But going back to the amnesic individuals, so here is the initial group of people that we worked with, and they had a variety of etiologies that resulted in bilateral hippocampal lesions in each of them, other than one who had a stronger left-sided lesion. And unfortunately, we don't have a scan for DG, who had anoxia and a defibrillator, so was unable to be scanned. But just to say that there was really quite a range in terms of severity of episodic memory impairment and future imagining impairment, which you see here, but still all of these individuals relative to controls on a test of future imagining showed statistically worse performance in generating details of future episodes. KC performed abysmally on this task, but it really shows you that each of these individuals were performing poorly. And still, this really is just a summary slide to show you that the individuals with hippocampal amnesia, indicated by the dashed line with the open triangles, looked very similar in their average discounting relative to controls, whereas in separate work, we've shown that individuals, not surprisingly, with ventromedial prefrontal cortex lesions are very steep discounters. And we've followed up that work separately. I'm happy to tell you about it. I might have another slide. I did want to mention that the research that I'm describing here or presenting to you was really led by some amazing graduate students in my lab. This research by Donna Kwan and by Jenkin Mock. And so, as some of you also might know, it turns out that if you provide people with a cue to imagine a future event that might occur when they're making decisions between accepting an immediate reward versus a future reward, then it actually changes their discounting behavior, and they tend to discount the future less. It's sort of intuitive. And this is an example of a kind of cue that we might give participants based on, we actually interviewed each participant and tailored the cues to the participant's life. We looked at their own journals, we interviewed family members. So this was really laborious work. And we provided an event cue prior to the participant making the decision. It actually stayed on the screen as they made the decision. And indeed, we did show, at least in controls, that the individuals showed less discounting. So they were subjectively valuing the future reward more if they saw a cue to imagine the future. And this really supports work that has already been conducted by some other groups, especially some earlier neuroimaging studies by Peters and Bushell and Benoit and colleagues. There are some really nice reviews of this work. And of course, this might not be a surprising finding. The amnesic individuals who have trouble imagining specific details did not show such a benefit. So they continue to discount the same way that they would have without the cues. And just to say that this work is very consistent with work by Daniela Palumbo, who was conducting separate research on the same question in parallel. And it was really nice to see that a very separate group of patients were showing very similar behaviors. So what about older adults? And I'm sort of giving away the answer now, but I did want to say that very quickly that the question remains also in older adults, are they going to show similar benefits when it comes to providing these future-oriented cues to imagine specific events that could occur upon receipt of the reward? And as you might see or might notice, the older adults, they do show typical discounting. And I think, again, I want to point to Kendra's work because I think it's really important to note that there are a lot of discrepancies in the literature regarding delay discounting in older adults. Some studies have shown steeper discounting, some have shown less steep discounting. We actually show slightly less steep discounting, which might explain, even though the older adults are benefiting from future imagining cues, they're not going to show as much of a benefit because they're already starting out as shallower discounters. But still, they do show a very similar pattern of results for $100 future reward amount and even for $2,000 future reward amount. So we see some really nice correspondence between younger and older adults in both typical discounting and with cues. And I want to say also that we did something very similar with probabilistic discounting. So rather than looking at time as a variable, we looked at the level of certainty in receiving a reward. And we found that both older and younger adults do not benefit from episodic like cues when they're performing probabilistic discounting. So it really seems to be a time-based phenomenon that we see in young and older adults. But it's not like no patient population or no interesting individual with an individual difference shows no benefit of cueing. Indeed, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex lesioned individuals who I mentioned earlier on who show very steep discounting do indeed benefit from cueing, perhaps because they don't really have anywhere to go but up. But this is work that was conducted along with Elisa Charmelli at University of Bologna and some of our trainees. So we showed that this group actually does show a very important benefit. So the work that I've shown you so far is really to make the case that if you have a task that doesn't require the generation of details, then perhaps you won't see difficulties in future thinking. And indeed, that is what we had shown, that these individuals don't have difficulties. People with episodic amnesia, individuals as they get older, don't seem to have difficulties making future regarding decisions relating to rewards. And we're now looking at losses as well, as long as there's no requirement to generate and bind details together in relation to those future events. And unfortunately, they don't seem to benefit from event cues. But again, that is certainly because they have these difficulties imagining those specific events. And so we decided to look at the same question with a different set of tasks. We were interested in whether a different type of tendency or bias that humans show in relation to temporal construal theory might answer the question that we had with respect to separating out this perhaps difficulty generating details from being able to make decisions or think about different points in time. And, oh, sorry, this is sort of out of order by accident. That last slide actually should have appeared after this. So one side note, I mentioned that I would have a side note, is that we were also interested, so sorry, moving back to discounting, we wanted to know so I mentioned earlier on that discounting also seems to be a strong predictor of different types of health-related behaviors and financial health as well. And during COVID, when we all had to pivot, some of my students were very interested in understanding if delay discounting might actually serve as a predictor of vaccine compliance and compliance with other public health measures. We're coming from Canada, and actually from Toronto, where many of these restrictions were in place and not really as violated maybe as in other places, but it was really a public health concern, and we were asked by the Public Health Agency of Canada to work on this question. And really, if you translate temporal discounting to a COVID-related situation, you can imagine the decision to be vaccinated today. You might expect to also think about the short-term consequences of being vaccinated, but then you also need to consider, of course, the long-term benefits of vaccination. And so discounting really is inherent in these kinds of decisions that we make, even if they're somewhat implicit. So an excellent former graduate student of mine, Julia Halalova, she was very interested in looking at these questions at a population level, and we ran a very large-scale study. It was actually an age-related study, and we were able to test individuals from 13 countries. They were all industrialized westernized countries. So, we can't generalize very far from these data. But just to show you the very quick result that even though there were different restrictions in place and different mandates or different, I guess, approaches that the governments took in these various countries, we did find that delay discounting predicted whether somebody chose to be vaccinated or not. And we followed this up in other work showing that not only did this apply to vaccine hesitancy, and I should say the sample of participants, it was over 7,000 participants who we included in the study, and then we actually had the opportunity to test them again a year later, half of those participants. The attrition rate was unfortunately quite high, but we were able to look at booster hesitancy as well in half of that sample. And we found indeed that that discounting performance at time one predicted whether somebody was going to accept a booster dose at time two. And we also looked at some other public health measures, including hand washing, physical distancing, and found actually an opposite relationship where delay discounting, people who were more steep in their discounting were more likely to engage in those types of public health measures, probably because there are different kinds of implications with respect to the time at which those public health measures are effective. So this is really just the bottom line, that delay discounting has diagnostic value, but beyond amnesic individuals and other individuals who we've tested in the past. And we have looked at queuing as well, and also found that we have some preliminary data to show that those same individuals who we investigated in our delay discounting studies, when we provided cues relating to imagining something that would happen after the pandemic, it actually seemed to alleviate their steep discounting. And they showed shallower discounting, and we hope that this is maybe a mechanism to induce higher rates of vaccine willingness. And then just a final note with respect to this research. In the course of running this study, we weren't just interested in delay discounting. And a very interesting, I think, finding was that we identified a subset of individuals at time one. There were about 250 individuals who indicated no intention of being vaccinated. And we found that, and what you see on this plot is that older individuals who were older individuals with lower intolerance of uncertainty. So individuals who were not intolerant of uncertainty, were less likely to be intolerant of uncertainty, they were actually less likely, surprisingly, to be willing to change their minds of being vaccinated relative to people who had higher intolerance of uncertainty. But as we move through this graph, so the older adults are represented by the lighter blue lines, younger adults who were higher in intolerance of uncertainty were actually more likely to change their minds. And those are really the individuals who we needed to target at the time of COVID to help them change their minds. So this work we're following up separately. So I was concluding before the delay discounting story, the COVID story, and I noticed that I didn't have my slide, but this is just to say again that individuals with hippocampal compromise due to a variety of etiologies that lead to more severe forms of amnesia and in healthy aging, that although their episodic memory and future imagining seem to be low, they seem to have little difficulty making these future regarding judgments relating to rewards. And so I already mentioned that I'd moved to temporal construal. So this is yet a different way to test the same kind of question. And it really, it's a theory that was described to account for a wide range of findings in the literature within perception, in temporal thinking, and also even in spatial thinking. The idea that when we think of things that are very close to ourselves in terms of distance, or proximal distance, in terms of temporal distance, the sooner, so with respect to time, if we think of something happening very soon, you can think of all the things that you are tasked with in the immediate future, compared to if you're thinking very far into the future, you're more likely to think of that future in more abstract terms. So this idea that we construe the immediate future in more concrete terms, more detailed terms relative to the distant future, where we would think of the future in more abstract ways. An example would be if you're willing to if you're asked to review a journal article, you're probably more willing to review it if it's set into the distant future, because you can't really think about all the details relating to the activities that you're going to engage in the distant future compared to the near future. And the spatial example, if I'm visiting New York City, if I'm right in the city, I can imagine all of the spatial details surrounding me, maybe even the perceptual details of buildings that are surrounding me and so on, compared to if I'm thinking about, imagining myself in Manhattan, but thinking about places that are much further away. I can't really think about all those spatial details surrounding me. And so again, Julia Halalova was interested in whether these kinds of tasks might help us to understand how older adults function, how these individuals with hippocampal amnesia might consider the near versus distant future. And so the kinds of tasks that we chose were actually tests that, again, did not require participants to generate narratives. They actually involved kind of forced choice decisions or ratings, so that the participants could showcase how they might think about the immediate versus distant future, but without having them generate all of these different details. And so an example of a task is a personal agency task. We wanted to know the extent to which one's view of personal actions are meaning-driven and causal. And so if you think about performing an activity tomorrow, you might think about that activity in a much more concrete way, such as if I said to you, imagine you were reading text tomorrow or a year from now. So if you're in the tomorrow condition, are you following lines of print or gaining knowledge? And if you survey many participants, you'll find that if people are thinking about reading tomorrow, they'll actually choose following lines of text, which is a much more concrete way of thinking, compared to if you ask them to imagine the same activity a year from now, they're more likely to say gaining knowledge, that it's a much more abstract way of thinking about that activity. And we had 25 examples that were presented to participants, and we wanted to know if that same kind of bias in thinking about the near future versus distant future would apply to not only our younger adults controls and older adult controls, but also to the patients that we tested. Another example is a self-efficacy task, where participants are asked to rate the level of confidence they have in performing different tasks. And they're either imagining performing the task in, well, tomorrow, which is the near future, or a year from now. And so an example would be to imagine that they need to spell 30 words, and participants' confidence is much higher the further into the future that they're imagining completing the task compared to if they're completing the task tomorrow. And we actually found, I know this is a very busy slide, but it really makes a separate point, which is that we were really interested in knowing if this tendency to think about the future, the near future in concrete terms and the distant future in more abstract terms, applies to each of the individual amnesic individuals that we were testing. We actually tested a group of people with hippocampal lesions, so that's the HC group, and then also a separate group of individuals with ventromedial prefrontal cortex lesions. I'll leave that aside for now, but just to focus on the hippocampal amnesic individuals, they showed actually every single one of those individuals demonstrated the tendency to think about near future activities and performance in more concrete terms compared to if they were thinking about those same activities in the distant future. And you can see that there's some variability in the control. So we actually have, if you test many people, you're going to find individuals who are showing either no difference between near and distant future, and some who even show an opposite pattern. But on average, they do show this tendency, and we did replicate this in older adults, and you're going to see that actually in the next slide, or in a later slide. But just to say that even with that individual variability, every single one of our hippocampal amnesics showed that typical tendency, suggesting that they do consider time in a very similar way, at least with respect to these kinds of tasks, to controls, despite their inability to imagine specific events in their future. And this is just to show you, this is actually performance on, so this was performance on the personal agency task. This is, reading text or imagining locking your door. That's another example. Where would you be do you think of yourself putting a key in the lock or securing your house, as the more abstract version? This task, this is the confidence ratings, and we see a very similar pattern of performance. Every single one of the individuals with hippocampal lesions showed the tendency to think about the near future in concrete terms and distant future in more abstract terms. And this is to show you that although the effect is quite small, it is significant. And we found that comparing young versus older adults in general, we see a very similar pattern of performance, where even though older adults their future imagining was, I wouldn't say impoverished, but it was less detailed, significantly less detailed than that of our younger adults. The older adults still showed a very typical temporal construal effect in their performance on the two tasks that I described here, and we've tested them on other tasks, and those were just examples. So just to conclude, on measures that are sensitive to manipulations of imagined temporal distance, amnesic individuals and older adults seem to retain flexible construal of events as a function of temporal distance. And this was seen on those two tasks that I described, the confidence ratings and also levels of agency, which relate to specific activities that might occur in the future. And these results are in line, I think, with the delay discounting data that I showed you earlier on. So this leads us to a conclusion that episodic memory, I don't want to say is not necessary, but may not be necessary for adaptive regard of future outcomes on the test that I described, and that, and including flexible construal of events as a function of temporal distance. And some of the work that I did not describe, just because we are short on time, relate to other kinds of temporal biases, one of which is how we view ourselves as getting better with time. So if you asked people if they feel like they've changed more from the past to today compared to today, that the amount of change that they're going to experience from today to the future, they will tend to say that they view themselves as having changed much more from the past to today to maintain that kind of self-efficacy. And we see very similar trends or tendencies in our patients who have hippocampal lesions. So even though they can't remember the past, imagine the future, they show this biased self-efficacy where they tend to view themselves as changing less from now to the future. And this really leads to kind of a larger view of how maybe the hippocampus works and how we should be thinking about episodic memory and future thinking and even spatial memory, which I didn't touch on today, but just the idea that the hippocampus might be needed for representing specific details and binding them together, often assessed with tests that have require a narrative structure, whereas some aspects of future thinking, and again, I didn't talk about the spatial navigation data that we have, may rely on more schematic representations that do not require the hippocampus. And it's represented here, but I won't get into the weeds. I just wanted to, again, acknowledge my trainees, my collaborators, some of whom are at Washington University, the Rotman Research Institute, and University of Bologna, and my lab in general and sources of support. And, I think I'm on time. So.
Much talking, but I'm asking questions. I'm really curious, in your COVID samples, did you see an elevated level of discounting overall? Because I know we observed that in the studies we were running.
Yeah, we did. And actually, we did. I really skimmed over the data there. We controlled for a number, or took into account a number of variables, including income level, age, type of work. We were actually also interested in frontline workers in that study. And we found that even taking those variables into account, we still showed overall elevated levels of delay discounting, but higher, significantly higher in those individuals who seem to be unwilling to be vaccinated.
You did a great job of pointing out the confound in the episodic future thinking literature between essentially what Eleanor would call scene construction and the future orientation. The two things are to some degree orthogonal. So just in relation to that, the last point you made, slide, I'm not sure you're aware of this, but Green Irish has shown that people with semantic dementia who have relatively intact insight, but who have severe impairments of semantic cognition, they're terrible at episodic. And the argument is the reason for this is, again, this is not a process pure task remotely. It requires a construction of a narrative. And that narrative requires semantic.
And she uses and you know, the use of the term scaffolding, I mean, it's necessarily, that's correct. And it's necessarily so. I mean, I can't, and that's where it becomes very difficult to, you know, separate these things.
So my question to you is, where does this leave the status of the dogma about episodic future thinking being, well, going back to Emil's original notion of mental time travel going in both directions, and this kind of continuity between episodic memory and episodic future thinking, because this research suggests that's not the case. There isn't a continuity.
That's it. So I would agree. I think there may be a continuity at some levels. I mean, depends on how you were, of course, how you're testing people, but at the level of semantic memory, and I'm trying to work through this as well. And I've been also thinking about some of what Donna Rosatis has been writing about, this idea that, you know, thinking about the self over time and personal identity, and at that level, you know, you could think of yourself as continuous, even without the ability to remember specific details. So that also throws a wrench into this whole story. But I think a really important point to make, and I don't want to say that this shows that there is absolutely no continuity, but I think it's really important to say that there are so many nuances, and that even Endel, he really, at the time of writing Elements of Episodic Memory, wanted to focus on how episodic memory is dissociated from semantic memory, how they're very different. But actually, if you read his work more closely, you see that he also felt that there are many areas of overlap and that they're not so separable. And it's clear from Vern's work, your work with Bree, that there are many considerations. I mean, even this relationship, one of the assumptions was that you need semantic memory in order to have episodic memory. But of course, that doesn't, some of the cases of semantic dementia suggest that that's not necessarily the case, not all the time. So it really, I think we need more sensitive tests like the kinds and measures like the kinds that Marin and others are developing, and other ways of testing these questions to separate out these different components, because episodic memory is not one thing. Future imagining is certainly not one thing.
And the campus is not alone, right? Because you've
Absolutely not. Yeah, no, and I hope
you've had some other, like also with the rental video prefrontal cortex, for example. So that's another roles that are complementary.
Yeah, I mean, even though I'm using this case study method, I really want to make clear that I do not believe that each function is assigned to a specific brain region. We don't believe that the brain works that way. I gave a very simplified picture, but I think it's still important to take note of impairment if you have a relatively clean neurological case, for example, and these examples of preservation. It says something about this brain structure, well, the hippocampus in the case that I'm describing, but it's not to disregard the network in which it's operating. And I can't say for certain that the hippocampus itself is not needed for what I described as preserved. It's perhaps more likely that other regions are involved in that same process and carrying performance in even neurotypical individuals. We just don't know based on even single cases. But I think piecing together these different sources of evidence is very important. And I think there was a question behind you also.
That was the vision is that certainty. It looked like there was a striking age of direction. Certainty. I was kind of curious, how was tolerance of certainty? Is that in like a prediction of it as to why we see such that random? It seems to hit a high.
Yeah, I want to be very, one thing I should have clarified, because I was really glossing over it in a way, especially because I realized that my slide was out of order and it kind of threw me for a loop. So there's a couple of things. One is that was based, actually, I'm sorry I didn't say this, on an intolerance of uncertainty scale, which actually doesn't take into account all the very different aspects or forms of uncertainty. But it does capture some aspects of uncertainty for the future. And there's actually two main factors relating to that scale. But one very important point that I did not want to ignore, and I shouldn't ignore, is that the sample of older adults, it actually, most of our sample of 7,000 participants, even though we were testing individuals from ages 18 to 85, we did not have a very, like, as high a representation of older adults, especially over 60. And so we really do have to look at this question further. I think the figure is striking. I mean, I can get to it quickly. Like it almost looks perfect in a way.
All of these are people who were not planning to get it.
Correct.
So of your 7,000,
this is only 244 people, actually, who at time one said, I am absolutely not going to be vaccinated. And we wanted to know what is associated with them changing their minds, because we did test them at time two and we were able to see it. Well, again, this is also self-report, so we're assuming that they're being truthful. We collected other data, by the way, relating to trust in science, to all sorts of variables that are associated with media exposure, with the choice to be vaccinated and actually to engage in other public health measures. And there's some other interesting patterns that we're learning about from those data. But this really was striking to us and something that we felt was worth reporting, but certainly worth following up. And if we look at intolerance of uncertainty as a form of anxiety, I should say that anxiety was a very strong predictor also in our sample of whether people were willing to be vaccinated. But anxiety could relate to many different things. It could be anxiety relating to the vaccine itself, to COVID, to
uncertainty specific. Some things are passing forward about
don't know.
they're going to survive.
Yeah, so we did actually text-based analysis of some of their reasons for not choosing to be vaccinated. And we have some interesting data relating to that. Some of it's preliminary, but some of it was actually reported in the paper that was recently accepted, showing that there were different answers with respect to anxiety, with respect to the vaccine versus when COVID might end, when the restrictions might be lifted. So, and also just one thing is that one interesting things that we're also following up on is whether people made decisions and actually admitted that they were making decisions that were more like self regarding versus helping other people. So that kind of reaction.
Great talking to you. So that's really compelling evidence of some preserved function in temporal lossing in these patients, and dissociations from construction. I guess I'm just wondering, do you have any evidence, or do you know of any evidence of music patients having preserved temporal lossing in the past, like estimating how long time, the duration of time is involved, or something else that was?
It's an excellent question. Yeah, so anecdotally, so HM and other individuals that have been described in the literature, including Kent, they would, so if you actually oriented them to the year, so you might, oftentimes we would say, how old are you? And without orienting them to the year, and they would often say that they're 10 years younger than they actually were, but they were older. They estimated themselves as older than they would be had they, given the time of their patients. So it's not like they're stuck in at that age at which they experience the lesion. They're updating even their age, but not enough. So it suggests that they're not time duration must at that level. I mean, there's certainly different levels of how we consider time. In terms of testing people in the moment, like we've tried to actually just in the moment to indicate when a minute has passed. It's really, really difficult to deploy that kind of task. But yeah,
or even like over retest sessions over weeks, there's a time compression there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's more of a time expansion. That's my feeling, but we haven't looked too deeply into it. It's a very good question.
Camila, do you have any questions online?
No, we do not have any questions.
So with that, let me just thank again Shayna Rosenbaum for a fantastic talk and for studying of our seminar series. Just thank you so much.
This is your spring seminar. I feel like I'm still stuck in winter.